The stagecoach wheel groaned its last protest as it settled into the red dust that was the main street of Red Hollow. For Eleanor Vance, the dust was the first and most persistent citizen she had met. It rose in a fine crimson cloud with every step, every gust of wind, coating the hem of her dark traveling dress and settling in a gritty film on her lips. The year was 1874, and this small settlement, straddling the line where Arizona territory bled into New Mexico territory, was to be her new home. She had come from Missouri, a preacher's daughter armed with a trunk of books and a steadfast belief that knowledge could bloom even in the harshest soil. Her charge was the town's one-room schoolhouse, a squat timber building whose bell tower sagged as if weary from the heat. Before she could even direct the freight wagon carrying her belongings toward the school, a commotion from the far end of the street seized the town's attention. A knot of men, their voices a low, angry buzz, had gathered before the swinging doors of the saloon. Their focus was a lone figure, a Navajo man, backed against a water trough. He stood tall despite a bloody scrape along his temple and the way he favored one leg. His face was a mask of stoic fury, his dark eyes missing nothing. "Found him with 3 of my best mares." "Sheriff," a burly man in a dusty rancher's coat shouted, jabbing a finger at the Navajo man. "Clear as day, a horse thief." The man with a star pinned to his vest, Sheriff Burke Reeves, looked profoundly tired. He held a rifle loosely, more as a prop than a threat, and his gaze flickered from the accused to the growing crowd. "Now, hold on, Jed, let's get the facts straight." But the facts seemed to matter less than the feeling. The heat, the dust, the simmering resentments of a hard land found a ready target. From the saloon's shaded boardwalk stepped a man whose fine suit and polished boots stood in stark opposition to the grit of the town. This was Edmund Caro, his silver hair gleaming in the sun, his voice a smooth, persuasive oil poured on a fire. "The facts, Sheriff," Caro said, his tone reasonable yet carrying an unmistakable edge of command, "seemed to be that this man was caught with stolen property. This is a simple matter. Our good people know how to deal with thieves. It keeps the community safe." A murmur of agreement rippled through the men. The word rope was spoken, low at first, then louder. Sheriff Reeves shifted his weight, his eyes pleading for a calm that had already fled. The Navajo man straightened his shoulders, his jaw tight, a silent testament to a pride that would not bow to their accusations. He said nothing, his silence a bolder defense than any words he could offer. Eleanor felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. She had seen this kind of fever before, a righteousness that was nothing more than a mob's hunger. Her father had preached against it, his voice thundering from the pulpit about the sanctity of justice, the sin of judging without trial. She watched as one of the men uncoiled a rope from his saddle horn, a gesture of grim finality. The air grew thick and still. Something inside Eleanor, a core of conviction forged in her father's church and tempered by her own quiet resolve, refused to let her stand by. She took a breath, the red dust filling her lungs, and walked forward. Her sensible black shoes made little sound in the thick dust as she moved past the freight wagon and toward the circle of men. They noticed her approach, their angry muttering faltering as this plainly dressed woman with a determined set to her chin stepped into their midst. She stopped a few feet from the sheriff, her gaze not on him, but on the faces in the crowd. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the tense air. It was not a loud voice, but it carried an authority that made them listen. "My name is Eleanor Vance. I am to be your new school teacher." A few of the men shuffled their feet, their expressions shifting from aggression to a sort of grudging respect for her position. Caro's smile tightened, a flicker of annoyance in his cool eyes. "Ma'am," the rancher named Jed grumbled, "this ain't no concern of yours. This is town business." "Is it the business of this town to condemn a man without a trial?" Eleanor asked, her eyes moving from one man to another. "I see no judge here. I see no jury. I see only angry men and a rope. Is that how justice is delivered in Red Hollow?" She let the question hang in the air. She could feel the Navajo man's eyes on her, a gaze of intense, unreadable scrutiny. He was caught with the horses. Someone else called out. Was he? Eleanor countered. Her tone even. Did any of you see him take them? Or did you find him on the road with horses you claim are yours? Is his word worth nothing? Is his only crime the color of his skin? Color. A flush of shame crept up the necks of some of the men. They were farmers, ranchers, storekeepers. They considered themselves decent, God-fearing people. Her words struck that chord of decency, the one they kept buried under the hardness of their lives. The law will handle this, Miss Vance, Sheriff Reeves said, finding his voice at last, though it was weak. Then let it, Eleanor said, turning her clear, unwavering gaze on him, as it is meant to, with a cell, a hearing, and a fair judgment, not with a rope thrown over a cottonwood branch. You are the law. Sheriff, I implore you to act like it. Or is your badge merely for decoration? The sheriff's face reddened. Caro took a step forward, his polished demeanor cracking slightly. The woman is new here. Sheriff, she doesn't understand our ways. Perhaps not, Eleanor replied, meeting Caro's cold stare without flinching. But I understand the ways of civilized men, and this is not it. You are shaming yourselves. You are shaming this town. She held their gazes, one by one. The man holding the rope slowly, hesitantly, began to coil it back up. The anger in the crowd was breaking, dissolving into an uneasy silence. They looked at each other, then at the ground, a collective shame dousing their fire. The moment had passed. Eleanor turned to the Navajo man. He had not moved, but the rigid defiance in his posture had softened into a watchful stillness. You are injured, she said simply. Come with me. I will clean that wound for you. Without waiting for an answer, she turned her back on the silent crowd and the flustered sheriff, and the quietly seething Edmund Caro, and began walking toward the schoolhouse. After a long moment, she heard the soft, uneven scuff of his moccasins in the dust behind her. He was following her. The small house behind the school was sparse, but clean. It smelled of pine wood and the faint, dry scent of old books. Eleanor directed him to a simple wooden chair at the table while she put a kettle on the stove. She did not ask his name, nor did she ask if he was guilty. The question seemed impertinent. She had acted not because she knew him to be innocent, but because she knew the mob to be wrong. He sat with a straight back, his hands resting on his knees. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps not much older than her own 23 years. His face, though grim, was etched with a sharp intelligence. When she brought a basin of warm water and a clean cloth to the table, he met her eyes. They will not let this go, he said. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. Let them not, Eleanor said, dipping the cloth into the water. Truth does not change with a man's opinion. She gently began to clean the gash on his temple. He did not flinch, though she knew the wound must sting. He watched her, his gaze so direct it felt as if he were looking past her skin and into the very workings of her soul. She focused on her task, on the steady movement of her hands. The world outside, with its dust and its anger, seemed to fall away, leaving only the quiet of this small room, the warmth of the water, and the presence of the man before her. My name is Ashki, he said, breaking the silence. Ashki Tozen. Eleanor Vance, she replied. She finished cleaning the wound and applied a simple bandage from her medical kit. Her work was neat, practical. You should rest. You have lost blood. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Gratitude. He was a man who used few words, but he made them count. The afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the schoolyard. Eleanor made them a simple meal of beans and cornbread. They ate in silence, a comfortable quiet settling between them. She knew it was dangerous, keeping him here. The town was watching. Caro was watching, but sending him away now, injured and with the whole town against him, felt like a deeper kind of danger. It felt like a betrayal of the very principles she had just stood for in the street. As darkness fell, a soft scratching sound came from the back door. Eleanor's heart leaped into her throat. She motioned for Ashki to be still, and she moved cautiously to the door. When she opened it, a crack. She saw a small, thin girl with enormous dark eyes standing on the step. It was Maya, one of the children she had seen watching the confrontation from a distance. The girl looked terrified, but she clutched something in her small fist. "For you, teacher," the girl whispered, her voice barely audible. She shoved a crumpled piece of paper into Eleanor's hand, then turned and vanished into the twilight as silently as she had appeared. Eleanor closed the door, her heart still pounding. She walked back to the table where the single oil lamp cast a warm, flickering glow. Ashki watched her, his expression questioning. She slowly uncrumpled the paper. It was a fragment, torn from a larger document, a receipt for the sale of livestock. The lettering was neat, the details precise, but it was the stamp at the bottom, a deep blue ink impression partially singed as if someone had tried to burn it. That made the air leave her lungs. It was an official seal, an ornate letter C encircled by the words, Caro Land and Freight Company. The paper was proof of a transaction, a legitimate sale, and it was Caro's name, not Ashki's, that was tied to these horses. She looked up from the scorched paper and met Ashki's gaze across the small, lamp-lit table. The street outside was quiet now, but the danger had not passed. It had simply changed its shape. It was no longer a loud, angry mob. It was a cold, calculated lie, and she was now standing in the very middle of it. A wanted man sitting at her table, and the only proof of his innocence, a singed piece of paper in her hand. The question of who the real thief was had just been answered. The more pressing question was what she was going to do about it. The thin walls of the house seemed to breathe with the night. Every rustle of wind in the dry grass, every distant howl of a coyote, felt like an intrusion. Eleanor Vance sat across from Ashki Tozin, the scorched receipt lying between them on the rough-hewn table, like a verdict waiting to be read. The oil lamp cast a small circle of defiant light, pushing back against a vast and hostile darkness. She had offered him the small cot in the corner, but he had refused, choosing instead to sit in the chair, a blanket draped over his shoulders, his rifle resting against the wall nearby. He was a sentry in her home, a silent guardian of a truth only they now shared. She smoothed the fragile paper with her fingertips, tracing the outline of the Caro Company's seal. The burn mark had deliberately obscured the date, a small but crucial piece of violence against the facts. "This changes things," she said, her voice a low murmur in the quiet room. Ashki's gaze was fixed on the paper, his expression unreadable. "It changes nothing," he answered. "His name is on the paper. Mine is on their tongues. In this town, that is all that matters." "They will listen to evidence," Eleanor insisted, though the words felt hollow even to her. A humorless smile touched his lips for a fleeting moment. "His evidence is a dozen angry men. Your evidence is a piece of burned paper delivered by a child." He paused, his dark eyes meeting hers. "You do not know these people. Caro promised land and horses to several of us who scouted for the army, a contract. He said it was a reward for our service. He paid for the horses, but the land deed was a lie. When we discovered the truth, he arranged this. He called me a thief to silence me, to discredit us all before we could expose him. His story came out in clipped, spare sentences, fragments of a larger betrayal. He spoke of promises made under a government flag, of trust offered and then spat upon. He was not just a man accused of stealing horses, he was a man whose honor had been methodically dismantled by a man in a fine suit. His fight was not for his freedom, but for his name. Listening to him, Eleanor felt her own resolve harden. Her father had taught her that faith without works is dead. To believe in justice was one thing, to act on it, To shelter it when it was wounded and hunted was another entirely. This was no longer a matter of abstract principle. It was a matter of the man sitting before her, breathing the same lamplit air. That night, sleep was a shallow, restless thing. She lay on her cot, listening to the quiet rhythm of Ashki's breathing, a sound that was both a comfort and a stark reminder of the danger she had invited into her life. She was a preacher's daughter. She had lived a life bound by clear rules and expectations. Helping a fugitive, an outsider as the town saw him, was a transgression so far beyond those boundaries she felt as if she had stepped into another country. Yet, a deeper conviction told her she was doing the only thing her faith demanded: to stand for the wronged, to offer sanctuary to the pursued. The small flame of the oil lamp, which she had left burning low, seemed a fragile but persistent symbol of that conviction. The morning arrived with a pale, dust-choked light. A sharp rap on the front door sent a jolt of fear through her. Ashki was on his feet in an instant, silent as a shadow, moving to the side of the door, out of sight. Eleanor took a breath to steady her hands and opened it. On the step stood a woman in the simple brown habit of a nun, her face weathered by the sun and framed by a white wimple. Her eyes were kind but missed nothing. "Good morning," the woman said, her voice warm with a slight Spanish accent. "I am Sister Magda. I heard we have a new school teacher. I was making my rounds and wanted to welcome you to Red Hollow." Eleanor's relief was so profound it almost made her dizzy. "Please, come in, Sister." Sister Magda stepped inside, her keen eyes sweeping the small room. She carried a basket filled with herbs and small vials. "I bring remedies," she explained. "The doctor is in Tucson, so we learn to make do. A little knowledge of God's green pharmacy can be a great blessing here." Her gaze lingered for a moment on the 2 plates from the night before, still on the table. She looked at the blanket folded neatly on the chair where Ashki had sat. Her expression did not change. But Eleanor felt as if the woman had read the entire story in those small details. "You seem troubled, my child," Sister Magda said gently, turning her perceptive gaze back to Eleanor. Before Eleanor could form a reply, a soft sound, a shifting of weight, came from the corner of the room. Sister Magda's eyes flickered toward the sound, and a deep understanding seemed to settle over her features. She did not act surprised or alarmed. She simply nodded, as if confirming something she already knew. "The world is full of troubles," the sister said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. She reached into her basket and pulled out a small cloth pouch. "This is for fevers and to keep wounds from turning bad. A poultice of yarrow and plantain. You boil it in a little water." She pressed the pouch into Eleanor's hand, her fingers giving a gentle, reassuring squeeze. "God asks us to be wise as serpents and gentle as doves. Sometimes, the wisest thing is to be quiet and tend to the wounded. I will pray for you, and for your guest." With another small nod, she was gone, leaving behind the clean, sharp scent of her herbs and a profound sense of gratitude in her wake. Eleanor was not entirely alone. She spent the day in the schoolhouse, the clamor of 20 children a strange counterpoint to the silent tension in the house behind it. She listened to them recite their letters, their voices innocent and clear, and she heard the echoes of their parents' conversations. One boy mentioned that his father was joining the posse to hunt for the Navajo thief. A girl whispered that Mr. Caro was offering a reward. The town's prejudice was a lesson being taught more effectively than any she could offer from a book. She saw Maya sitting in the front row, her large eyes fixed on Eleanor, a silent bond of shared secrecy between them. In the afternoon, needing supplies and a feel for the town's mood, she walked to the general store. The air was thick with gossip. As she paid for her flour and beans, Deputy Walt Hensley tipped his hat to her. He was a young man with a kind face and an air of perpetual apology. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice low, "I wanted to say that was a brave thing you did yesterday." "I only did what I thought was right, Deputy." "Still," he said, glancing around nervously, "Sheriff Reeves is under a lot of pressure from Mr. Caro. Just Be careful." He seemed to want to say more, but his courage failed him. He gave her a weak smile and retreated. He was a decent man, but Eleanor could see he was a man trapped between his conscience and his fear. Her next stop was the blacksmith's forge at the edge of town. The ring of hammer on anvil was a steady, powerful heartbeat. Inside, stripped to the waist and gleaming with sweat, a broad-shouldered black man was shaping a glowing piece of iron. This was Jonah Pike, a former soldier with the Union Army, a man whose freedom had been forged in the very fires he now commanded. He looked up as she approached, his expression wary. "Ma'am." "Mr. Pike," Eleanor began, choosing her words with care, "I am told you are a man who understands the importance of a proper brand on a horse, and how easily a brand can be misread." Jonah stopped his work, placing the hot iron into a trough of water, which hissed and steamed. He turned to face her fully, his eyes searching her face. "A brand tells a story. Ma'am, tells who a horse belongs to. But like any story, it can be changed, if you know how. There are 3 mares," Eleanor said quietly. "Their story is being told incorrectly. They need a new one, a story that will let them travel without being noticed." Jonah Pike studied her for a long moment. He had seen the confrontation yesterday. He knew what she was asking, and he knew the risk. He wiped his hands on a rag. "The west pasture behind the old mission," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Leave them there after dark. Their story will be different by morning." He asked no more questions. He was a man who had seen enough of the world's injustice to recognize it without needing it explained. As Eleanor left, she felt another small piece of hope click into place. She had allies, quiet ones, but they were there. When she returned to the house, the sun was setting, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple. She told Ashki about Jonah Pike. He listened, his expression unchanging, but she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. It was not trust, not yet, but it was the beginning of it, the belief that perhaps not all white people were like Caro. They sat in the growing twilight, the thin walls of the house once again the only barrier between them and the town. The quiet felt fragile, temporary. Every sound was magnified. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Then it came, not the gentle scratch of a child's hand, nor the polite rap of a nun. It was a heavy, official knock on the door. It was the sound of the law, a law she was now breaking. Eleanor and Ashki exchanged a look. There was no time to hide, no place to run. She stood up, her back straight, and walked to the door. She opened it to find Sheriff Burke Reeves standing on her doorstep, his face grim in the fading light. He was not alone. Behind him, she could see the silhouette of Deputy Hensley. The sheriff held up a folded piece of paper. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth, "I have a warrant to search these premises." The piece of paper in Sheriff Reeves's hand seemed to suck the last of the light from the evening. For a heartbeat, Eleanor Vance was frozen, her mind a blank slate. Then, in the second before she stepped aside to let him pass, she saw a flicker of movement behind her. Ashki Tosin did not make a sound. He simply melted away from the table, and with the silent grace of a predator, lifted a single, wide plank from the floorboards near the hearth. He slipped into the dark, shallow space below and lowered the plank back into place, just as the sheriff's boots crossed her threshold. "By what authority do you have this warrant?" Sheriff Eleanor asked, her voice a cool counterpoint to the frantic pounding of her heart. She kept her body positioned to block his immediate view of the room, buying another precious second. "By the authority of a territorial judge, Miss Vance," Reeves said, his tone weary. He brushed past her, his gaze sweeping the small, single room. Deputy Walt Hensley followed, his eyes cast down, his movements clumsy with reluctance. "We have reason to believe you are harboring a fugitive." From the corner of her eye, Eleanor saw a figure detach itself from the shadows of the schoolhouse. Edmund Caro. He did not approach the house, but leaned against the rail of the schoolyard fence, a cigar glowing in the dusk like a single, malevolent eye. He was not here to participate. He was here to watch, to ensure his will was done. The sheriff was not a free agent. He was a puppet, and his master was observing the performance. "A fugitive," Eleanor repeated, closing the door with a soft click. She turned, her expression one of polite, academic curiosity. "That is a strong word. Sheriff, I believe the man you are referring to has not been tried, let alone convicted. Last I checked, our laws still made that distinction." Reeves sighed, a long, tired exhalation of breath. He ignored her comment and began his search. It was a perfunctory, almost listless affair. He opened the single cupboard, peered into the empty flour bin, and nudged her small trunk with the toe of his boot. It was the search of a man who did not expect to find anything but was required to look. Walt Hensley was even less effective. He checked the curtains as if expecting a grown man to be hiding behind the thin calico. He bumped into the table, rattling the tin plates. Every one of his movements was an apology. Eleanor stood by the hearth, her hands clasped before her, a picture of calm composure. Her mind, however, was a whirlwind. She could feel Ashki's presence beneath the floor, a silent, coiled tension just inches from the sheriff's feet. She prayed the boards would not creak, that a cough or a shifting of weight would not betray him. "You are being remarkably thorough." "Sheriff," she commented, her tone light, "does your warrant also permit you to inspect my lesson plans for the children I am teaching them about the Constitution? Perhaps you would be interested in the sections on unreasonable search and seizure." Reeves's jaw tightened. He shot her a look of pure exasperation. "Ma'am, I am just doing my job." "Of course you are," Eleanor said smoothly, "and a difficult job it must be. Attempting to serve the law while also serving the interests of men like Mr. Caro." That struck a nerve. The sheriff's face flushed a dull red. He turned away from her and gestured to Walt. "Check the back." As Walt moved toward the rear of the small house, there was a soft scratching at the back door. Eleanor's blood ran cold. It was Maya. The little girl was holding a slate, and she peered into the room with wide, frightened eyes. "Teacher," Maya began, her voice a small, high pipe, "I finished the sums, and I—" Her voice trailed off as she saw the two men in uniform. She looked from them to Eleanor, her expression a mixture of confusion and fear. She was about to say more, perhaps ask about the man from the night before, and in that moment, Eleanor knew they were lost. "But Walt Hensley acted—" He moved quickly, placing his body between Maya and the sheriff. "Well now, little lady," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Look at you, doing your schoolwork after hours. Your teacher is a bit busy right now. Why don't you run along home, show her that slate tomorrow?" He reached out and gently patted her head, a gesture so avuncular and kind that it was utterly disarming. He guided the small girl back out the door and closed it firmly behind her. Leaning against it for a moment, he looked at Eleanor, and in his eyes, she saw a clear message. He had helped her. He had chosen, in that small, critical moment, to intervene. Reeves, who had been inspecting the empty space under Eleanor's cot, seemed not to have noticed the significance of the exchange. "Nothing," he muttered, straightening up. "There is nothing here." He walked back to the center of the room, his boots passing directly over the plank that concealed Ashki. The wood groaned softly. Eleanor held her breath, certain the sound had been as loud as a gunshot, but the sheriff did not seem to hear it. His mind was elsewhere, likely on the powerful man watching him from the fence line. "I hope you are satisfied." "Sheriff," Eleanor said, finding her voice, "my reputation in this town is now thoroughly compromised. My home has been invaded, and you have found nothing but a school teacher who is, I admit, guilty of owning several books and a rather sharp tongue. Will that be all?" Reeves had the decency to look ashamed. He would not meet her eyes. "For now," he said gruffly. He turned and walked out the door, with Walt trailing behind him like a chastened dog. Eleanor watched them go. She saw the sheriff say a few words to Caro, who then straightened up from the fence, took one last long look at her small house, and strolled back toward the saloon. The immediate threat was gone, but the larger one remained, as patient and as menacing as a coiled snake. The last rays of the setting sun slanted through the schoolhouse window, illuminating the large blackboard. The light was a deep, bloody red, as if the sky itself were wounded and bleeding onto the surface where she wrote out lessons of logic and reason. It was a beautiful and terrible sight, an omen of a storm to come. She secured the door and waited, her ear pressed against the wood, until the sounds of the town faded into the chirping of crickets. Only then did she move back to the hearth and tap lightly on the floor. The plank lifted, and Ashki emerged from the darkness. He was covered in dust and cobwebs, but his movements were fluid, his eyes sharp. He looked around the room, at the disarray left by the search, then at her. "They will be back," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." "I cannot stay," he continued, his voice low and firm. "I have brought you enough trouble. Caro will not stop. He will find a way to hurt you to get to me." Eleanor watched him as he walked to the corner and picked up his rifle. He was right, of course. Everything he said was the logical, sensible truth. Her safety, her position, her very life were at risk as long as he was here. The prudent thing to do would be to let him go, to let him melt back into the wilderness and pray that Caro's attention would move on. She could go back to being the school teacher, to living within the boundaries she had always known. But something had shifted inside her. It had started in the dusty street when she faced the mob, and it had solidified in the quiet moments in this room, sharing a meal, listening to a story of betrayal. She had seen the raw injustice, held the proof of it in her hand. To turn away now would be to turn away from herself, from the core of the woman her father had raised her to be. It was more than a choice about him. It was a choice about her. "No," she said. Ashki paused, his hand on the rifle stock. He turned to look at her, his expression a mask of stoic surprise. "You heard what I said," he stated. "He will not stop." "Then we will not stop," she countered, her voice ringing with a certainty that surprised even her. She took a step toward him, closing the distance between them. The small room felt charged, the air electric with the gravity of their decision. "You are right. It is dangerous. They will come back. But if you walk out that door alone tonight, you give them exactly what they want. You become the guilty man. Running in the dark, the lie wins." She looked directly into his eyes, refusing to let him look away. "I will not be a party to that lie. I stood in the street and spoke of justice. Was that just talk? Was it just words to make myself feel righteous for a moment? If I send you away now, it was..." He stood silent, his gaze searching her face, trying to understand the source of this fierce, unexpected resolve. "Do not go," she said, her voice softening but losing none of its intensity. "Stay, I have chosen..." The words hung in the air between them, simple and absolute. She had drawn a line in the red dust of Red Hollow, not just for him, but for herself. She was no longer an impartial observer. She had taken a side. A long moment passed. The only sound was the low hiss of the oil lamp. Finally, Ashki gave a slow, deliberate nod. He leaned his rifle back against the wall. The decision was made. They spent the next few hours in a state of tense quiet, waiting. They both knew the night was not over. Caro was not a man to be thwarted by a failed search. He operated by his own set of rules, and the law was merely a tool to be used and discarded as needed. The warning came not as a knock, but as the sharp crack of splintering wood. The back door, the one Maya had used, burst inward, its frame shattered. Two figures, their faces obscured by the darkness, loomed in the doorway. They were not lawmen. They were Caro's men, sent to finish the job the sheriff could not. Ashki had his rifle in his hands before the door hit the floor. He moved in front of Eleanor, shielding her with his body. "Go!" he hissed, his voice a low growl. "Through the schoolhouse, now!" There was no time for argument, no time for anything but survival. The fragile peace of their chosen sanctuary was shattered. The storm had broken. Chaos erupted in the small house. Ashki Tozin moved with a lethal economy, not firing his rifle but using it as a club, slamming the heavy stock into the shoulder of the first man through the door. The man grunted in pain and stumbled backward, giving Eleanor Vance the moment she needed. She did not scream. Her fear was a cold, sharp thing that honed her senses. She grabbed the oil lamp from the table and hurled it. It shattered against the doorframe, splashing burning oil. Flames leapt up the dry wood, a sudden, hungry wall of light and heat that drove the intruders back. "The horses," Ashki said, his voice tight. He grabbed her arm, pulling her through the connecting door into the dark, empty schoolhouse. The smell of chalk dust and old paper filled her lungs. He shoved the heavy teacher's desk against the door, a flimsy barricade, but it would buy them seconds. They scrambled out a side window, dropping into the cool, dusty darkness of the schoolyard. The town was asleep, unaware of the small war that had just begun. Under the vast, star-dusted canopy of the sky, they ran. They retrieved their horses from the small lean to where Ashki had hidden them, the animals already saddled and ready. He had anticipated this. Jonah Pike had done his work. The brands on the mares were now a meaningless smudge, their stories rewritten in scarred flesh. As they mounted, Eleanor glanced back. The fire in her small home was growing, casting a frantic, dancing orange light against the night sky. It was a beacon, a signal to their pursuers. There was no turning back. Everything she owned, her books, her letters, her past, was turning to ash. All she had was the horse beneath her, the 2 canteens of water sloshing at her side, and the silent, determined man leading her out into the vast, unforgiving wilderness of the open desert. The moon was a sliver, offering little light. Ashki rode with an uncanny sense of direction, his body a part of his horse's rhythm. Eleanor, less experienced, struggled to keep pace, the hard leather of the saddle a brutal reality against her bones. She had ridden before, but never like this. Never with the cold breath of pursuit on her neck. Dawn found them in a landscape of rock and scrub, the horizon a bleak, endless line. The red dust of Red Hollow was far behind them, but the threat of it felt closer than ever. Ashki paused at the crest of a low rise, dismounting to study their back trail. Eleanor slid from her horse, her muscles screaming in protest. "They are coming," he said, his voice flat. He pointed to a faint plume of dust in the distance, a barely visible smudge against the pale morning sky. 4 riders. Fear, a raw and primal thing, clawed at Eleanor's throat. 4 men. Sheriff Reeves and Deputy Hensley would be 2 of them. The other 2 would be Caro's hired guns, men unburdened by the niceties of the law. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice raspy from the dust. "We ride," he answered, swinging back into his saddle, "and we pray for the wind to rise." His prayer was answered in a way neither of them could have anticipated. By midday, the air grew thick and heavy. The sky turned a sickly yellow-brown, the sun a pale, hazy disk. The wind began to pick up, not as a cooling breeze, but as a hot, scouring breath that whipped sand into their eyes and mouths. Ashki pulled a cloth over his face and motioned for her to do the same. "A storm!" he shouted over the rising howl of the wind. "It will cover our tracks, but it can also kill us." The world dissolved into a maelstrom of sand and wind. Visibility dropped to a few feet. The sky and the earth merged into a single, roaring vortex of grit. Eleanor could no longer see Ashki, only the vague shape of his horse just ahead. She wrapped the reins tight around her hands, a fraying connection to her guide, to her own survival. The horse beneath her was a terrified, bucking creature, fighting against the unseen force of the storm. The wind tore at her dress, ripped the pins from her hair, and screamed in her ears like 1,000 accusing voices. This was nature in its purest, most indifferent form. It was not malicious, but it would scour them from the earth without a second thought. All the laws and prejudices of Red Hollow, all of Edmund Caro's power and wealth, meant nothing out here. The storm was the only authority. Eleanor bent low over her horse's neck, shielding her face, her carefully constructed world stripped away until all that remained was the will to endure. The neat, ordered lines of her faith, of her civilized upbringing, were being erased by the chaotic fury of the wind. She felt the social bindings that had defined her snap and fly away like a broken rein. Through the howling chaos, she heard a sound that was not the wind, a gunshot, sharp, distinct, and terrifyingly close. Another followed. Their pursuers had not given up. They were still out there, blundering through the storm just as they were. A short distance away, in the same blinding chaos, Sheriff Reeves fought to control his spooked horse. He could barely see Walt Hensley beside him, a ghostly shape in the swirling dust. The other two riders, Caro's men, were just visible, their forms distorted by the sand. One of them, a man with a cruel, narrow face, raised his pistol and fired blindly into the storm. "Hold your fire, you fool!" Reeves yelled, his words snatched away by the wind. "You'll hit one of us." The man ignored him, firing again. His loyalty was to Caro's money, not the sheriff's authority. He was not trying to capture Ashki, he was trying to kill him. Walt Hensley watched, his face a mask of misery and indecision. He had followed his orders, followed his sheriff into this storm, but firing blindly at a man and a woman in this hellscape was not law enforcement. It was murder. He saw the other hired gun raise his rifle, taking aim in the general direction Ashki and Eleanor had fled. In that moment, something inside the young deputy finally broke. His fear of the sheriff, his fear of Caro, was eclipsed by a greater fear, the fear of his own conscience. He drew his own revolver. He did not aim at the man. He aimed at the sky. He fired a single, loud, warning shot. The sound was sharp, authoritative. The hired gun flinched, turning toward the deputy in surprise. "That's enough," Walt shouted, his voice cracking but firm. "The storm is too thick. We've lost them. We're turning back." The hired gun sneered. "Caro paid us to find them." "Caro ain't out here. Is he?" Walt shot back, his courage growing with every word. He fired another shot into the air. "We turn back now? Or so help me, my next shot won't be so high." Sheriff Reeves looked at his deputy, a flicker of something, perhaps surprise, perhaps even grudging respect, in his tired eyes. He had lost control of the situation. He looked into the blinding wall of sand, then back at his deputy's determined face. He made his decision. "The deputy is right," Reeves declared, his voice carrying the weight of command for the first time that day. "We're heading back. Now." The hired guns hesitated. Then, seeing the resolve in the lawmen's faces, they reluctantly turned their horses. The posse retreated, swallowed by the storm they had tried to master. Walt's shots had served another purpose. The sound, though muffled by the wind, had given Ashki a direction. He grabbed Eleanor's reins, pulling her horse alongside his. "This way," he yelled, pointing toward a dark, vertical slash in the landscape, a narrow opening in a sheer rock wall that was almost invisible in the storm. "Box Canyon. It's our only chance." He urged the horses forward, toward the promise of shelter. They scrambled over loose rock. The entrance to the canyon a dark maw. The wind was slightly less ferocious here, the high rock walls offering some protection. They were almost safe. But the ground was treacherous, slick with a fine layer of sand over smooth stone. Ashki's horse, exhausted and terrified, lost its footing. The animal went down with a panicked whinny, its legs scrambling for purchase. Ashki was thrown clear, landing hard against the unforgiving rock face of the canyon wall. Eleanor leaped from her horse, her heart seizing with a new terror. She rushed to his side. He was pushing himself up, his face pale and tight with pain. His left arm was bent at an unnatural angle. A dark stain was already spreading through the sleeve of his shirt, a stark crimson bloom against the dusty fabric. The canteen on his saddle had been crushed in the fall, its precious contents spilling out to be instantly swallowed by the thirsty sand. He looked at his arm, then at her, his expression grim. "Go!" he grunted, the word forced through a wall of pain. "Take the water. Leave me." Eleanor looked from his shattered arm to the single remaining canteen on her own saddle. The storm still howled at the mouth of the canyon, a relentless, elemental roar. They had escaped their pursuers, but they had run straight into a different kind of trap. They were cornered, wounded, and their water was gone. The desert does not bargain. It only takes— "Leave me," Ashki Tozin gasped, the words a raw whisper of pain. "Take the water. Go." Eleanor Vance looked at his pale, sweat-sheened face, then at the grotesque angle of his arm. She looked at the single canteen on her saddle, a pitiful defense against the vast, thirsty desert. Then she looked back at him. The thought of leaving him did not even form. It was an impossibility, a denial of the choice she had already made back in her small, now burning home. "I will not," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. The school teacher from Missouri, the woman who had lived her life by rule and scripture, was gone, scoured away by the wind and the dust. In her place was someone she did not yet recognize, a woman forged in fear and necessity. "Now, help me get you to the back of the canyon." Leaning on her, his breath hissing through clenched teeth with every agonizing step, they moved deeper into the narrow fissure in the rock. The high walls offered a refuge from the worst of the storm, which still raged at the canyon's mouth. They found a shallow overhang, a slight recess in the stone that offered a modicum of shelter. She eased him to the ground, his back against the rock. The time for fear was over. It had been a wild, frantic thing, but it had burned itself out, leaving behind a cold and terrible clarity. What needed to be done was as clear and as brutal as the landscape around them. She was all he had. She took his knife from its sheath. It was a practical, heavy tool. Then, with a gentleness that belied the grimness of her task, she cut away the sleeve of his shirt. The wound was worse than she had imagined. The fall had caused a compound fracture, a jagged piece of bone tenting the skin. But there was more. The cloth was shredded around a dark, ugly tear in the flesh just above the break. A ricochet. One of the pursuer's blind shots in the storm had found its mark, lodging a piece of lead in his arm before he fell. The crimson stain was spreading, turning the dust to a dark, ominous mud. He was already drifting, his eyes losing focus. The shock and the pain were taking him. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that if she did not act, he would die here, in this anonymous canyon of bones. First, fire. His saddlebag held a small tinderbox with flint and steel. She gathered dry scrub and twigs that had collected in the crevices of the rock, shielded from the wind. Her hands trembled, but she forced them steady, striking the flint against the steel again and again until a tiny spark caught in the tinder. She nursed the fragile flame, feeding it, building it into a small, hot fire that pushed back the gloom. Next, water. She took her canteen, unscrewed the cap, and poured a small, precious amount onto a strip of cloth torn from her petticoat. She cleaned the wound as best she could, her touch methodical. Then she took the knife and held the blade in the heart of the fire. She watched the steel turn from gray to orange, then to a dull cherry red. The sight of it, a tool of civilization being turned into a primitive instrument of surgery, was both horrifying and necessary. It was a covenant she was making with survival, a pact sealed in fire. She knelt beside him. "This will hurt," she whispered, not knowing if he could hear her. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. He had begun to mutter, low sounds in his own language, words of fever and memory. She took a deep breath and probed the wound with the sterilized tip of the knife. He cried out, a raw, animal sound of agony that echoed off the canyon walls. His body arched in a spasm of pain. She bit her lip until she tasted blood. Her entire being focused on the task. She found it, the small, misshapen piece of lead, and with a delicate, steady hand, she prized it out. It fell onto the sand with a soft thud. But the work was not done. The wound gaped open, an invitation to fever and death. She had seen her father stitch a farmer's hand once, his movements precise. She had watched Sister Magda's neat, efficient work. She pulled a long, sturdy thread from the hem of her petticoat, the last piece of her old life to be sacrificed. She threaded it through the eye of a mending needle from her small sewing kit, a kit she always carried for repairs. She had never imagined a repair like this. She held the hot needle in the flame for a moment, then began to sew his flesh back together. Each stitch was a prayer. Each pull of the thread was an act of will against the encroaching darkness. Outside, the storm shrieked. Inside their small shelter, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire, her own ragged breathing, and his delirious whispers. He spoke of mountains and clear water, of honor betrayed, of a home lost to him. She did not understand the words, but she understood the soul-deep pain they carried. She was not just mending his arm, she was trying to hold together the pieces of a shattered man. When she was finished, her work was clumsy, ugly, but the wound was closed. She used the last of the clean cloth to fashion a bandage, using strips of leather and a sturdy piece of wood from a dead branch. She splinted the broken bone, immobilizing it as best she could. She was slick with sweat, her hands covered in his blood. She slumped back against the rock, utterly spent. She had transformed. The schoolteacher had become a savior, and the price of that transformation was the loss of every certainty she had ever known. As the afternoon wore on, the storm began to abate. The wind's howl softened to a mournful sigh, and the world outside their shelter slowly came back into focus. And with the silence, a new threat appeared. Figures on horseback at the mouth of the canyon. 4 of them. Reeves, Hensley, and the 2 hired guns. They sat their horses, framed against the bruised yellow sky like horsemen of a grim apocalypse. Sheriff Reeves rode a few paces forward, his voice echoing unnaturally in the sudden stillness. "Miss Vance, we know you are in there." "It is over." Eleanor scrambled to Ashki's side. He was barely conscious, his eyes glazed with fever. She looked at his rifle, lying where he had dropped it. "Send out the Navajo, and you can walk away free," Reeves called out, his voice carrying the strain of a man trying to convince himself as much as her. "No charges. You were misled. Caro has given his word. Just send him out." Behind the sheriff, she saw Edmund Caro. He had joined them. He said nothing, simply watched, a faint, confident smile on his face. His presence was the real message. The law was his tool, and it had cornered them. Reeves's offer was a lifeline back to the world she knew, a world of safety and order. All she had to do was betray the man whose life she had just saved. All she had to do was give him to the mob. Ashki's eyes flickered open. He looked at her, and in their feverish depths, she saw it. Not defiance, not fear. It was trust, a complete and absolute trust that she now held in her hands. He had placed his life, his honor, his very soul in her keeping. She did not answer the sheriff. Words were useless now. She crawled over to the rifle. It felt alien in her hands, a heavy, cold instrument of brutal purpose. She had never fired a gun in her life. She rested the barrel on a rock, taking aim not at any of the men, but at the canyon wall beside them. She closed her eyes and pulled the trigger. The shot was a deafening crack of defiance, a sound that ripped through the quiet canyon. Splinters of rock exploded from the wall near the sheriff's head. His horse reared in terror. The message was unmistakable. There would be no deals, There would be no surrender. For a long moment, nobody moved. The echo of the gunshot faded, leaving a ringing silence. Caro's smile had vanished, replaced by a mask of cold fury. Then, the sky, which had offered a brief respite, turned on them once more. The wind picked up again, this time with a renewed, vicious force. A second, darker wall of dust and sand rolled toward them. A towering wave of earth rising from the plains. The desert itself seemed to be rendering its judgment. Reeves shouted something lost to the rising shriek of the wind. He and his men fought to control their panicking horses. Staying was impossible. They were forced to turn, to retreat from the canyon, to flee the wrath of the second storm. They were swallowed by the swirling brown chaos, and then they were gone. Eleanor let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding. She let the heavy rifle slide from her grasp. They were safe, for now. She turned back to Ashki. The fire had burned low, and the shadows were creeping back into their small shelter. She placed a hand on his forehead. His skin was dry, burning to the touch. The fever had taken hold. She looked out at the raging storm, then back at the man shivering beside her. The fight against the posse was over. A new, more insidious battle had just begun. A battle against the fire consuming him from within. As the wind moaned a desolate prayer through the rocks, she began her vigil, alone in the heart of the storm, with nothing but her own fragile hope to keep the darkness at bay. She began to pray, her words a silent whisper against the rising shriek of the wind. The world returned slowly, piece by agonizing piece. First, the silence. The storm had screamed itself into exhaustion, leaving behind a profound, ringing quiet. Then came the cold, a deep desert chill that seeped into Eleanor Vance's bones. She had been slumped against the canyon wall, a half-conscious sentinel, her body a shield against the drafts that snaked into their shallow shelter. The fire was little more than a pile of glowing embers, a faint orange heart beating weakly in the darkness. She stirred, every muscle protesting, and her first thought was of him. She reached out a trembling hand and touched Ashki Tozin's forehead. The skin was no longer a dry, burning furnace. It was cool, damp with a fine sheen of sweat. The fever had broken. A wave of relief so powerful it felt like a physical blow washed over her, leaving her weak and dizzy. He was alive. They had survived. She pushed herself to her feet, her limbs stiff and clumsy. The small embers of the fire were a priority. She carefully added the last of her scavenged twigs, coaxing the flames back to life. Then, water. The canteen was nearly empty, its contents barely enough to wet a cloth. But as the first hints of a gray, pre-dawn light began to soften the edges of the canyon, she saw something she had missed in the violent darkness. A dark, wet stain on the rock wall near the back of their overhang. A tiny, almost imperceptible trickle of moisture seeping from a fissure in the stone, collecting in a small, shallow basin no bigger than her hand. It was a miracle, a quiet gift from the unforgiving rock. She spent the next hour collecting the water, drop by precious drop, letting it fill a tin cup from her saddlebag. When she had enough, she brought it to him. His eyes were open, not glazed and distant as they had been, but clear, lucid. He watched her approach, his gaze holding a new depth, a new awareness. "You stayed," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "I told you I had chosen," she answered simply. She supported his head, bringing the cup to his lips. He drank slowly, thirstily, the water a visible blessing. When he had finished, he lay back, his eyes closing for a moment. "The bleeding has stopped," she reported, her tone practical, almost clinical, a defense against the tide of emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "The splint seems to be holding, but you will need a proper doctor for the bone." He looked at his bandaged, splinted arm, then back at her. "You are a strange woman." Eleanor Vance. A small, weary smile touched her lips. You are not the first person to tell me that. The day passed in a slow, quiet rhythm of recovery. They shared the last of their dried beef. She ventured out of the canyon and found that the storm had washed the world clean, leaving behind a landscape of stark, raw beauty. There was no sign of their pursuers. For the moment, they were safe, hidden in the desert's embrace. As evening fell, they sat together by the small, crackling fire. The oppressive heat of the day had given way to the deep, star-filled cold of the desert night. The silence between them was no longer tense or uncertain. It was a comfortable, shared space, built on the foundation of the trial they had endured together. "What will you do?" she asked softly, breaking the quiet. "When your arm is healed, where will you go?" He stared into the flames for a long time before answering. "I do not know. Before, I was fighting for my name, for the truth. Now, that all seems very far away. This land." He gestured to the vast darkness beyond the canyon mouth. "It does not care about a man's name. It only cares if he can survive." "There is more to life than survival," she said. "Is there?" he asked, a hint of the old cynicism in his voice. "For your people, perhaps. For mine. Survival is a victory." He shifted, his gaze turning inward. "My people speak of Hozo. It means balance, beauty, walking in the right way. I have not walked in that way for a long time. I have walked a path of anger. Caro took more than my horses. He took my balance. He tried to make me a ghost in my own land." "You are not a ghost," she said, her voice firm. He looked at her, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "No, because of you." They fell silent again, the weight of his words settling between them. Eleanor thought about her own life, the straight, narrow path she had always walked. She had believed freedom was found within the pages of books, in the order of a well-run classroom, in the moral certainties of her father's sermons. But out here, with everything stripped away, she was discovering a different kind of freedom. It was not about where you could go, but about who you chose to be when all other choices were taken away. It was the freedom to stand for something, even if it meant standing alone in a storm. "I used to think I was free," she said, her voice a near whisper. "In Missouri, I followed every rule. I did everything that was expected of me. I was a dutiful daughter, a good Christian. I kept myself tied up in neat knots. I thought that was piety. I thought it was strength. But it was just fear, fear of living, fear of making a choice that was truly my own." She looked at her hands, still stained and rough from her work on his arm. They were not the hands of the woman who had arrived in Red Hollow. Ashki watched her, his expression softening. He had seen her courage, but now he was seeing the source of it, not an absence of fear, but a victory over it. "You are not tied now," he said quietly. She looked at him, her eyes shining in the firelight. The air grew still, charged with an unspoken truth. The bond between them was no longer just that of a rescuer and a victim, or a protector and the protected. It had become something deeper, something forged in violence and tenderness, in fire and water. She needed to change the bandage on his wound. As she knelt beside him, she began to gently unwrap the crude knot she had tied in the cloth. Her fingers brushed against his skin. A current, warm and startling, passed between them. He did not move, did not breathe. Her hand stilled. She looked up, her face just inches from his. All the defenses she had built around her heart, all the rules and reservations, felt as fragile as old lace. She was terrified. But it was a new kind of terror, a fear of stepping into a light so bright it might consume her. "Untie me slowly," she whispered, the words barely audible. She was not talking about the bandage anymore. She was talking about the knots in her soul, the bindings she had wrapped around her own heart for a lifetime. It was a plea, a permission, an offering. A low sound, a soft moan of understanding and reverence, came from deep in his chest. He slowly raised his good hand, his right hand, and gently covered her own. Stilling her fingers on the knot, his touch was warm. solid, an anchor in a world that had been spinning out of control. "God," he breathed, his voice thick with an emotion she could not name. "I am already yours." The world seemed to fall away. There was only the crackle of the fire, the vast silence of the desert night, and the profound, soul-shaking truth of his words. He leaned forward, his movement slow, deliberate, giving her every chance to turn away. She did not. She met him halfway, a silent surrender and a fierce claiming all in one. The touch of his lips was tentative at first, then firm, a kiss that spoke of gratitude, of shared pain, and of a hope so new and fragile it was a miracle it existed at all. Their breath mingled, their hands intertwined over the bandage that had become a symbol of their bond. The fire cast their shadows, now merged as one, dancing against the ancient stone walls of the canyon as the flame slowly burned down to embers. When dawn broke, painting the canyon rim with strokes of rose and gold, it found them sitting side by side, a blanket shared against the morning chill. The night had passed in a haze of quiet intimacy and whispered truths. A new, unbreakable covenant had been made, but the new light also brought a return to their harsh reality. "We cannot stay here," Eleanor said, her voice quiet but resolute. "No," he agreed, "and we cannot go back." She thought of Sister Magda, of the woman's quiet wisdom and the network of aid she seemed to command. The nun had spoken of a mission south of the border, in Sonora, a place of sanctuary, a place where a person's past was their own business, as long as they were willing to work and live in peace. "There is a place," Eleanor said, looking south toward a horizon she could not see but could now imagine, across the border, in Mexico, a rancho near a town called San Gabriel. Ashki followed her gaze. The idea of leaving the land of his birth, the very earth that held the bones of his ancestors, was a painful one. It was another form of exile, but to stay was to be hunted, to live as a ghost. To go south was a chance to live, to build something new, to walk in balance again. He looked at Eleanor, at the quiet strength in her profile, at the way the morning light caught in her unbound hair. His home was not a place on a map anymore. It was the woman sitting beside him. "Then we ride south," he said. The decision was made. Together, they would face the dawn. The border was not a line drawn on a map. It was a change in the color of the earth, a subtle shift in the scent of the air, a softening of the landscape from jagged rock to rolling, sun-baked hills dotted with hardy mesquite and palo verde trees. They rode south for days, following a faint trail that Sister Magda had described to Eleanor Vance, a path used by those who moved between worlds. Ashki Tozin's arm was a constant, throbbing source of pain, but he never complained. He navigated by the sun and the stars, his focus absolute, while Eleanor tended to his wound, rationed their dwindling supplies, and watched their back trail with a vigilance that had become second nature. They were a self-contained unit of two, bound by a shared past of violence and a future that was a complete unknown. They found Rancho San Gabriel nestled in a green valley, a startling splash of life fed by a river that wound like a silver ribbon through the dry land. Whitewashed adobe buildings with red tile roofs were arranged around a central courtyard where a fountain murmured a constant, cooling prayer. The air smelled of wood smoke, livestock, and blooming bougainvillea. It was a place of peace, an island of tranquility in a harsh world, and it felt as foreign and as miraculous to Eleanor as the surface of the moon. A woman with silver-streaked black hair braided into a single thick plait and a face mapped with the lines of a long and knowing life met them at the main gate. She was Doña Isabella, the matriarch of the rancho. She looked at Eleanor's dusty, torn dress, at Ashki's splinted arm and the fever that still clung to the edges of his eyes, and at the weary desperation that shadowed them both. Her gaze was shrewd, but not unkind. It was the look of a woman who had seen everything and was surprised by nothing. "You are hurt," she said, her English accented but clear. It was a statement, not a question. "You need food, water, a place to heal. The rest of the story can wait." Stories are for after, when the body is mended. She led them not to a bunkhouse, but to a small, clean room off the main courtyard. It had a proper bed with clean linens and a small window that looked out onto a garden brimming with herbs and flowers. Doña Isabella brought them broth, fresh bread, and a pungent herbal salve for Ashki's arm. She asked no names and offered none of her own beyond a simple, "I am Isabella." Her acceptance was a gift, offered without condition or question. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Eleanor felt the tight knot of fear in her chest begin to loosen. A few days later, after the fever had fully receded and some strength had returned to Ashki's limbs, they were visited by another of the rancho's fixtures. Padre Esteban was a small, wiry man with a face as brown and wrinkled as a walnut. He found them sitting in the shade of the courtyard, Eleanor reading aloud from a book of Spanish poetry she had found, Ashki listening, his eyes closed. "It is a beautiful language, is it not?" the priest said, his voice gentle. "It is good for prayers and for love songs." He sat with them, not as an inquisitor, but as a fellow traveler resting in the shade. "Doña Isabella tells me you have come a long way." "We have," Eleanor confirmed. "And that you carry heavy burdens," he continued, his gaze resting on Ashki's arm, then on the haunted look that still lingered in Eleanor's eyes. "God is less interested in where you have been, my children, and more interested in where you are going. Will you stay here long?" The question hung in the air. Stay. The idea was a luxury they had not dared to consider. Ashki opened his eyes and looked at the priest. "We have no names here." Padre Esteban smiled, a warm, knowing expression. "Everyone has a name given by their mother, and a name given by God. The names men give you. Those are just labels. They can be peeled off. Here, a person is known by their work, by the kindness in their hands. What can your hands do?" The question was directed at Ashki, who looked at his own strong right hand, then at the healing left one. "I know horses." "And you, my child?" the priest asked Eleanor. "I am a teacher," she said. "I can mend things, and I am learning to heal them." "Then you have everything you need," Padre Esteban said, standing. "You have names enough for San Gabriel. Welcome." And so they stayed. The weeks bled into months, and a season turned. The harsh, desperate edges of their flight softened into the steady, quiet rhythm of life on the rancho. Eleanor found her place in the herb garden with Doña Isabella and the other women. She learned the secrets of the plants, which leaves to crush for a fever, which roots to boil for a cough. She discovered she had a steady hand and a calm presence, and soon the women of the rancho were calling for her when a child was sick or a birth was imminent. One night, under the soft glow of a dozen candles, she helped a young woman deliver her first child, a healthy baby boy whose first cry filled the small room with a sound of pure, unadulterated hope. Holding the small, squirming life in her hands, Eleanor felt a profound sense of purpose settle over her. This was healing. This was life. Ashki, in turn, found his own healing in the rancho's sprawling corrals. Doña Isabella's husband had left her with a herd of wild mustangs, beautiful, untamable creatures that ran in the hills. Ashki began to work with them. He did not break them in the way other men did, with force and fear. He spent days, weeks, simply being with them, until they accepted his presence. He listened to them. He seemed to understand their language of twitching ears and stamping hooves, and he asked them to join him in a partnership. Soon, he was riding the most spirited of the stallions, and the children of the rancho would gather to watch in awe. He began to teach them, showing them how to sit a horse, how to be firm but gentle, how to earn an animal's trust. In the laughter of the children and the trust of the horses, he began to find the balance, the hozo, that he had lost. One dusty afternoon, a traveler arrived, a stoic man leading a tired mule. He was part of the quiet network that Sister Magda commanded, a chain of compassionate souls that stretched across the border. And with him was a small, silent girl with enormous dark eyes. It was Maya. The reunion was a quiet, tearful affair. The child simply walked into Eleanor's arms and held on, a silent testament to the bond they had formed. She became their child, their shared responsibility. Eleanor taught her to read and write in both English and Spanish, her small classroom now the shade of a pepper tree. Ashki taught her to ride, and the girl's silent watchfulness bloomed into a quiet confidence. They were a family, forged not by blood, but by choice and circumstance. The story of the American teacher and the Navajo warrior who had escaped a hanging and found refuge in Sonora began to spread through the small villages. It became a local legend, a tale told around firesides, growing with each telling until they were figures of myth. They heard whispers of their own story and found it amusing, a strange, romanticized echo of their terrifying reality. Their life was not a legend. It was the quiet, steady work of each day. The past, however, was not as distant as they hoped. A letter arrived, smuggled across the border by a trader, hidden in the false bottom of a crate of supplies. It was from Walt Hensley. The paper was cheap. The ink faded. The words hurried. It was a message from a ghost world. He wrote that Caro was not a man to forget a slight. He had hired new men, professional manhunters, and had been asking questions all along the border. Sheriff Reeves, Walt wrote, was a broken man, drinking heavily. A sheriff in name only. The letter was a warning. Be careful, stay hidden. The letter was a cold reminder that their peace was a fragile thing, a beautiful bubble that could be burst at any moment. The fear, which had receded to a dull ache, sharpened once more. They discussed taking new names, of disappearing completely, but to do so felt like a surrender, an admission that Caro had won, that he had the power to erase who they were. They chose to remain Eleanor and Ashki, a quiet act of defiance. The blow, when it came, was delivered not by a man with a gun, but by a young boy, a shepherd no older than Maya, who came running into the rancho one evening, his face flushed with dust and urgency. He had been at a trading post miles to the north and had heard the talk of the freighters. "It is the man from Red Hollow," the boy panted, his words tumbling out in a mix of Spanish and English. "The rich one. Caro. He has bought the water." Eleanor felt a chill creep up her spine. "What water?" "The river," the boy said, his eyes wide. "The one that flows into the Dine Valley. He has papers from the government. He is building fences. He says the water is his now. The people will have nothing to drink." The word struck Ashki like a physical blow. He stood up, his face a mask of cold fury. This was not about a handful of horses anymore. It was not about his name, his honor. This was about the survival of his people. Caro was not just stealing from him. He was trying to choke the life from an entire community. Water is life, and Caro was stealing it. All the peace he had found in this valley, all the healing, vanished in that moment, burned away by a righteous and terrible anger. He looked at Eleanor, and she saw the decision in his eyes before he spoke the words. The legend of the warrior was about to become real. "I am going back," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. The peace of Sonora was over. The road to Red Hollow was waiting. The decision to return was not made in anger, but in a quiet, solemn resolve that settled over Rancho San Gabriel. This was no longer a personal flight for survival. It had become a fight for the lives of others. Eleanor Vance watched Ashki Tozin as he prepared, his movements precise and deliberate. He was no longer just the horse whisperer of Sonora, but the warrior he had been trained to be. Yet, she knew that his greatest weapon would not be the rifle he cleaned and oiled with such care, but the truth, and the truth required more than one voice to be heard. "You will not go alone," she said, meeting his gaze across the quiet courtyard. It was not a question, but a statement of fact. Doña Isabella and Padre Esteban stood with them, their faces etched with concern. "It is a dangerous road, my children," the priest said softly. "Caro is a man with long arms and a short memory for mercy." "Which is why we cannot fight him with his own weapons," Eleanor replied, her voice steady. "We cannot fight him with violence. We must fight him with the law. The irony was not lost on her. The law in Red Hollow had been a twisted, pliable thing in Edmund Caro's hands. But somewhere, beyond the dusty streets of a single town, a larger and more just law had to exist. She refused to believe otherwise. Her plan was audacious, bordering on foolish, but it was the only path she could see that did not end in more bloodshed. They would not sneak back into Red Hollow. They would ride to Tucson, the territorial capital, and demand a legal hearing. Before they left, they gathered their evidence, their small arsenal of truth. Eleanor carefully retrieved the singed piece of receipt that Maya had given her, a fragile testament to Caro's initial crime. She wrote a long, detailed letter to Sister Magda, entrusting it to a traveling merchant. In it, she explained their plan and asked the nun to be ready to testify about Caro's attempt to obscure the date on the document and her own knowledge of his dealings. Padre Esteban provided his own contribution. He sat at a small wooden desk, his hand moving slowly but surely across a piece of fine paper. He wrote a letter of character, addressed to the circuit judge in Tucson, attesting to the peaceful and honorable nature of the man known as Ashki and the woman known as Eleanor. He wrote not as a priest, but as a man who had observed them, a witness to their quiet dignity. He sealed it with the wax of his small mission, the imprint of the cross a small shield against the secular world they were about to enter. Their most crucial piece of evidence, however, lay back across the border, in the smoke and fire of a blacksmith's forge. A message was sent through the same quiet channels that had brought Maya to them. A single question. For Jonah Pike, do you still have your ledger? The journey north was a reversal of their desperate flight south. They were no longer running from something, but toward it. They rode with purpose, their faces set toward the future. They crossed the border under the cover of a moonless night, the familiar landscape of Arizona territory feeling both alien and like a homecoming. They met Walt Hensley in a dry arroyo miles from Red Hollow. The deputy was thinner, his face etched with a constant, weary anxiety. The decency that Eleanor had glimpsed in him was now at war with a profound and soul-crushing fear. "You are crazy," he whispered, his eyes darting around as if Caro himself might rise from the dust. "Both of you, coming back here." "We came back because Caro is stealing the water from the Dine," Ashki said, his voice a low rumble. "Does your law allow for that?" "Deputy." Walt flinched. "He has papers. From the land office. It all looks legal." The horse sale looked legal, too. Eleanor countered gently. "Until you looked closer. We are not asking you to arrest him. Walt, we are asking you to help us get a hearing. A real one. In Tucson. Present the evidence to a judge who is not in Caro's pocket." The deputy chewed on his lip, his internal conflict playing out on his face. He was a man drowning in inches of water, paralyzed by his fear of a single man. "Reeves is no help," he finally admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "Caro holds a debt over his head, a gambling marker from a long time ago, and he arranged the sheriff's appointment. Reeves is a prisoner." "Then you must act," Eleanor urged. "You took an oath. This is your chance to honor it. Not for us, for the people Caro is destroying." He looked at them, at the quiet determination in their faces. He saw two people who had lost everything and were still willing to fight, while he, a man with a badge and a gun, had done nothing. A flicker of his old self, the young man who had wanted to stand for something, ignited in his eyes. "All right," he said, the word a gust of exhaled fear and newfound resolve. "I'll do it. I'll petition Judge Albright when he comes through next week. I'll tell him I have new evidence in the horse theft case and that it connects to the water rights. He is a fair man. He will listen." Their final ally was waiting for them at his forge. Jonah Pike did not say a word when they rode up. He simply wiped his hands on a leather apron, walked to a heavy wooden chest in the corner of his workshop, and unlocked it. He pulled out a thick, leather-bound ledger. The pages were filled with his strong, clear script, a meticulous record of every horse he had shoed, every brand he had repaired. every piece of metal he had shaped, the sparks from his anvil, where he forged tools of labor and construction, seemed to represent the forging of truth itself. He flipped through the pages and pointed to an entry. 3 mares. He read aloud. Sold by Jed Miller to the Caro Land and Freight Company. I reshoed them a week before they went missing. Noted a fresh brand. Poorly done. Meant to obscure the original. Here are my drawings of both. His ledger was undeniable. It was the work of a craftsman, a record of fact written in soot and sweat. It was the missing piece, the corroborating evidence that turned their single receipt into a pattern of calculated fraud. With their evidence gathered and Walt's promise secured, they found a place to wait, a small, abandoned line shack in the hills overlooking the territory. The days were tense, a slow tightening of a knot. The news came via a sympathetic ranch hand. Judge Albright had agreed to the hearing. It would be held in a large tent set up on the outskirts of Tucson, a makeshift courthouse for a territory still finding its legal footing. Edmund Caro, however, was not a man to be outmaneuvered. He arrived in Tucson with his own legal counsel, a slick, well-dressed lawyer from back east who spoke in circles and could make the truth sound like a lie. They saw him from a distance, Caro looking as cool and confident as ever, a man entirely certain of his own power. The day before the hearing, Eleanor worked with Maya on her reading. The little girl had blossomed in their care, her quietness now a sign of thoughtful observation rather than fear. She was their reason, the future they were fighting for. Eleanor felt a fierce, protective love for the child, a love that was the fuel for her courage. "When this is over," Eleanor said, stroking Maya's dark hair, "we will go back to the rancho. We will have a real school with a real blackboard." Maya looked up at her, a rare, bright smile on her face. "And I can help you teach." "You can," Eleanor promised. That evening, as the sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the landscape, Eleanor called for Maya to come in for supper. There was no answer. She called again, a note of unease creeping into her voice. Still nothing. A cold dread, familiar and sickening, washed over her. She and Ashki began to search, their calls growing more frantic. They scoured the area around the shack, their hearts pounding a rhythm of rising panic. But there was no sign of her. The only thing they found, lying in the dust near a cluster of rocks where Maya liked to play, was a single, brightly colored hair ribbon. A ribbon Eleanor had tied into her hair that very morning. Maya was gone, and they both knew, with a certainty that was as cold and as sharp as a shard of glass, that this was the work of Edmund Caro. He could not fight their evidence, so he had stolen their heart. The morning of the hearing dawned brittle and cold. The absence of Maya was a physical ache in Eleanor Vance's chest, a hollow space that made it hard to breathe. To walk into that tent, to face Edmund Caro while Maya was in his clutches, felt like an impossible act of betrayal. Ashki Tozin stood beside her, his face a mask carved from stone, but she could feel the rage simmering just beneath the surface, a dangerous, volcanic pressure. He wanted to tear the territory apart to find their daughter. It was her hand on his arm, her low, steady voice, that held him in check. "This is how we get her back. Ashki," she had whispered as they rode toward Tucson. "Not with a gun, with the truth. We must believe in that, or we have nothing." He had said nothing, but his hand had briefly covered hers, a silent agreement. Their grief was a shared burden, a cold fire that would fuel them through the ordeal ahead. The courthouse was a massive canvas tent, a temporary cathedral of justice erected in the dust. It was already filled with the curious and the concerned, a cross-section of the territory from dusty prospectors to soberly dressed townsfolk. Judge Albright sat at a rough plank table at the front, a formidable man with a heavy brow and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Eleanor and Ashki took their seats, a small island of quiet resolve in a sea of murmuring speculation. Caro was already there, flanked by his lawyer, looking as composed and unruffled as if he were attending a Sunday service. He met Eleanor's gaze and gave a slight, almost imperceptible smile. It was the smile of a man holding all the cards, and it sent a sliver of ice through her veins. The proceedings began, and Caro's lawyer was as smooth and poisonous as a rattlesnake. He painted Ashki as a transient, a malcontent with a history of grievances. He called his first witness, a ranch hand who swore under oath that he had seen Ashki skulking around the stolen horses days before the incident. His story, a neat and tidy parcel of lies. When it was Eleanor's turn, she walked to the front of the tent, her steps steady. She did not speak with passion or anger. She spoke as a schoolteacher, laying out facts with a cold, irrefutable logic. She produced the scorched receipt, a meaningless scrap of paper. Caro's lawyer scoffed. "It proves nothing." "On its own, perhaps," Eleanor conceded. "But evidence is not a single thread. It is a rope, woven of many strands." Her first strand was Jonah Pike. The blacksmith walked to the stand, his massive presence commanding a nervous silence. He presented his ledger, its pages filled with the undeniable truth of his craft. He explained the brands, the original and the crude forgery, his drawings clear and precise. The lawyer tried to insinuate that a blacksmith's records were unreliable, but the sheer, physical reality of the book, its weight and detail, spoke for itself. The second strand was Sister Magda, the nun, who had traveled all the way from her mission, spoke with a quiet authority that no lawyer could shake. She identified the receipt and pointed to the burn mark. "This is not an accident," she said, her clear voice reaching every corner of the tent. "It is a deliberate act, an attempt to erase the date of the sale, to make it seem as if the transaction happened after the horses were already in another's possession. It is the mark of a lie." The final strand was the most difficult. Deputy Walt Hensley was called to the stand. He looked pale and sick, but as he met Eleanor's encouraging gaze, he straightened his shoulders in a low, halting voice that grew stronger with every word. He confessed. He told the judge how he had been ordered to stand down, how the pressure from Caro, funneled through the sheriff, had been immense. "I stood by," he said, his voice thick with shame. "I knew it was wrong, but I was afraid. I was a coward. I let my fear get in the way of my oath." A gasp went through the crowd. This was not just an accusation. It was a confession from inside the machinery of the law itself. Caro's face had lost its composure. A muscle twitched in his jaw. His lawyer leaped to his feet with objections, but Judge Albright waved him to silence, his eyes fixed on Walt. It was then that Caro played his final, desperate card. He gave a slight nod to a man standing near the entrance of the tent, the same narrow-faced man who had fired blindly into the sandstorm. The man slipped out of the tent. A moment later, a child's cry of terror cut through the air. Ashki was on his feet in an instant, a guttural roar of fury in his throat. The proceedings dissolved into chaos. Everyone rushed outside. There, in the dusty open space before the tent, Caro's hired gun stood with his arm locked around Maya's throat, a pistol pressed to her small head. The child was rigid with terror, her face a pale, tear-streaked mask. "This hearing is over," the hired gun snarled, his eyes darting around. "Everyone stays back, or the girl is finished." Caro stood on the edge of the crowd, his expression one of grim satisfaction. He had moved the conflict from a place of law and reason to one of brute force, the only arena where he was guaranteed to win. Ashki started forward, his body a coiled spring of lethal intent, but Eleanor grabbed his arm. "No," she breathed, her voice filled with a desperate plea. "He wants you to. Do not give him the excuse." In the middle of the tense standoff, caught between Caro's man and the horrified townspeople, stood Sheriff Burke Reeves. He looked from the terrified child to the cold, triumphant face of Edmund Caro. In that instant, everything seemed to crystallize for him. The weight of his gambling debt, the shame of his compromised badge, the echo of Walt's confession, the innocent face of the child whose life now hung in the balance, all the small surrenders, All the moments he had looked away had led to this. This was the sum of his cowardice. Something inside the tired, broken man finally snapped. A flicker of the man he had once wanted to be. The man who had first pinned on the star with a sense of pride, flared to life. His face, which had been a mask of weary resignation, hardened into lines of cold, clear resolve. He slowly drew his service revolver. He did not point it at Ashki. He did not point it at the crowd. He leveled it squarely at the man holding Maya. "You heard the man?" Caro said, his voice laced with mocking confidence. "This is over." "Yes, it is," Sheriff Reeves said, his voice not loud, but carrying a weight of authority that stunned everyone into silence. He took a deliberate step forward, planting his feet in the dust. He was no longer Caro's pawn. He was the law. He looked directly at the hired gun. "Let the child go," he said. The hired gun laughed. A short, ugly sound. "You do not give me orders, old man." Reeves' expression did not change. "I am the sheriff of this county, and I am giving you one last order. Drop the weapon." The finality in his voice was absolute. The hired gun saw the look in the sheriff's eyes and knew this was not a bluff. For a terrifying second, no one moved. Then, the hired gun made his choice. He shoved Maya away from him and swung his pistol toward Reeves. 2 shots exploded in the same instant. So close together they sounded like one from the sheriff's revolver, one from Ashki's, which had appeared in his hands as if by magic. The hired gun was thrown backward, a look of shocked surprise on his face, and crumpled to the ground. For a moment, there was a deafening silence, broken only by Maya's terrified sobs. The dust, kicked up by the commotion, began to slowly settle, and in the clear, hard light of the afternoon, the truth was finally visible to everyone. Ashki did not look at Caro. He did not look at the fallen gunman. He ran to Maya, scooping her into his arms, burying his face in her hair, murmuring to her in his own language words of comfort and love. Sheriff Reeves stood over the body of the hired gun, smoke curling from the barrel of his revolver. He looked up, his gaze sweeping past the stunned crowd until it landed on Edmund Caro. Caro was white as a sheet, his empire of lies and intimidation collapsing around him. "Edmund Caro," Reeves said, his voice clear and steady. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, extortion, and kidnapping." Back inside the tent, with Caro in handcuffs and a stunned silence having fallen over the proceedings, Judge Albright delivered his verdict. He declared the water rights contract fraudulent, obtained through coercion and deceit. He ordered that Edmund Caro's assets be seized to make full restitution to the Navajo families he had displaced. As his final act, he looked at Burke Reeves. The sheriff slowly unpinned the star from his vest and laid it on the judge's table. His work was done. His honor, in one final, violent act of courage, was restored. The river that ran through the valley was the keeper of time. It had seen seasons turn for 2 decades, its patient current washing away the sharp edges of memory, leaving behind the smooth, solid stones of a life well lived. The year was 1895, and Rancho San Gabriel was no longer just a refuge. It was a home, a thriving community, woven from the threads of quiet labor and mutual respect. The simple wooden fence that marked the boundary of their small homestead was not a barrier to keep the world out, but a line to welcome it in. Eleanor Vance's hands, once stained with the ink of lesson plans and the blood of a desperate, life-saving surgery, were now most often dusted with the fragrant pollen of herbs from her garden. She had learned the deep, quiet language of plants from Doña Isabella, and her reputation as a healer, a woman with a gentle touch and a calming presence, had spread through the sun-baked hills of Sonora. She now sat beside a young mother, rocking a newborn baby, her soft humming a counterpoint to the cooing of the infant. The lines around Eleanor's eyes were etched by sun and laughter, and threads of silver were woven through her dark hair. In the main corral, the air was filled with the rhythmic stomp of hooves and the scent of horses and warm leather. Ashki Tozin moved with the same quiet grace he had always possessed, but the tension in his shoulders was gone, replaced by a deep and settled calm. He was working with a magnificent white stallion, a creature of fire and spirit, preparing it for the traveling Wild West show that passed through Sonora each year. He was not a horsebreaker, but a partner to the animals, his methods a silent conversation of trust and respect. His arm, once shattered, was now strong, the scar on it a faint, silvery map of a past he no longer fled. His hair, too, was touched by the same silver as Eleanor's, a shared testament to the years. Under the shade of a sprawling pepper tree, a group of children sat in a rapt circle, their dark eyes fixed on their teacher. A young woman with a serene face and a quiet confidence stood before them, a slate in her hand. It was Maya, the small, terrified girl who had pressed a scorched piece of paper into a teacher's hand had become a teacher herself, the legacy of hope and knowledge passed on to a new generation. Into this peaceful tableau rode a stranger. He was a young man from back east, barely out of his teens, with an earnest face, ink stains on his fingers, and a notebook in his saddlebag. He had followed the faint, romantic trail of a legend, a story that was whispered in saloons and trading posts all along the border, the tale of a renegade Navajo warrior and the courageous schoolteacher who had saved him. He found his mythic figures living a life of such profound and simple peace that it seemed to contradict the violent drama of their story. That evening, he sat with Eleanor and Ashki on their small porch, the murmur of the river a constant companion. The young writer, whose name was Samuel, was filled with questions, his pen poised eagerly over his notebook. "They say you faced down a lynch mob all by yourself, ma'am," he began, his eyes shining, "and that you held off a sheriff's posse with a single rifle." Eleanor smiled, a gentle, slightly weary expression. "The stories people tell are often simpler than the truth, Samuel, and sometimes more exciting. It is true that I spoke up when I saw an injustice, and it is true that a rifle was fired, but I was not alone, and I was very, very afraid." "And you, sir," he said, turning to Ashki, "they say you were a scout for the army, betrayed and framed for a crime you did not commit, that you fought a dozen men to escape." Ashki looked out at the darkening landscape, at the familiar shapes of the hills against the purple sky. "The legend has the sharp edges of a broken bottle," he said, his voice a low, thoughtful rumble. "Our life has the smooth curves of a river stone. The legend remembers the gunshots. It forgets the years of quiet work it took to build this fence, to gentle that horse, to see that child." He nodded toward the small adobe where Maya now lived. "Grow into the woman she is." Samuel was momentarily speechless. This was not the pulp adventure he had been chasing. It was something deeper, quieter, and far more real. "But the trial," he persisted. "Caro, the stolen water rights, is that part true?" Eleanor went inside and returned with a small wooden box. It held a few mementos, the single, brightly colored hair ribbon Maya had lost on the day she was taken, a pressed flower from her herb garden, and a faded postcard. She handed the postcard to the young writer. The postmark was from Red Hollow, dated several years prior. The handwriting was familiar. "It is from Deputy, Sheriff Hensley now," she explained. "He sends a card every year or so." Samuel read the faded ink. The words described a town slowly healing. Edmund Caro had died in a territorial prison. His assets were liquidated, and the land, along with its precious water, was returned to the Navajo families who had lived there for generations. The Caro Land and Freight Company was a ghost, its name a cautionary tale. "What about the other one?" Samuel asked. "Sheriff Reeves." "Walt wrote about him once," Eleanor said softly. "He never wore a badge again. He took a job as a station guard for the stagecoach line, out on a lonely stretch of road. He lived a simple life and died a few years ago. I like to think he found his own kind of peace." She looked at Ashki. He was a man caught in a trap, but in the end, when it mattered most, He chose to be brave. The young writer looked from the postcard to the two people sitting before him in the twilight. He was beginning to understand. The story was not about the dramatic climax in Tucson. That was just the end of a chapter. The real story was in all the quiet, unwritten chapters that came after. It was in the daily choice to heal, to build, to teach, to love. Justice was not a single, thunderous moment of courtroom victory. It was the patient, persistent flow of the river, slowly, over years, wearing down the hardest stone and making the valley green. Later that night, long after the young writer had retired to the guest room Doña Isabella kept for travelers, Eleanor and Ashki stood by the river's edge. The moon was high and bright, casting a silver path on the dark, moving water. A comfortable silence stretched between them, a silence filled with 2 decades of shared understanding. He reached out and took her hand, his thumb gently tracing the lines on her skin. She leaned her head against his shoulder, the years falling away until they were once again just 2 survivors in a canyon, finding solace in the quiet of a desert night. She looked up at him, at the face she knew better than her own, and a lifetime of love and gratitude filled her heart. She placed her free hand on his chest, feeling the steady, familiar beat of his heart beneath her palm. She spoke a few words in the Navajo language he had taught her over the long, peaceful years, her voice a soft, certain whisper in the vast, quiet night. You are my home. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales. Like this video. And support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.